right, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for today's session, Preparing for Food Safety and Regulatory Realities of 2025. My name is Alex Ball, and I work here in the marketing department at WorkForge, and I am very excited to have you all join us and appreciative of your time today. Before we get started, I'm going to roll through a couple of quick housekeeping items. Everyone will be on mute by default today, so if you do have questions, technical needs, etc., please use the questions section on the lower right hand of your LiveStorm panel there, or the chat feature, and we will help you as soon as possible. We will also automatically send you a copy of the recording and the slides later today from today's presentation so that you can rewatch and utilize the information in these slides to help you in your day-to-day. I am really excited to have today's guest speaker, Erik Kurdelak, joining us. Erik has over 25 years of experience in food safety and works with WorkForge on all of our food safety content. He has been with the state of Indiana as a subject matter expert for the Food Protection Division. He has done extensive work with Purdue University in their food sciences, and he's the founding board member of the Central Indiana Food Hub and Sustainability Center. I've had the chance to listen to Erik speak in a couple of times, and it's always highly educational and a really enjoyable session. So greatly appreciate you joining us today, Erik, and I'm going to move things on to you now.
All right. Thank you, Alex. So welcome to the conversation. Today, we're going to be looking at several different issues. We'll be looking at the state of the industry with respect to regulatory guidance and regulatory expectations. We'll be looking at some of the inspection trends, also looking at some of the known changes, things that are coming, that are already here that we've got to deal with in our operations. And we're going to be looking at proposed changes, things that haven't hit yet that are in the pipeline. We'll be looking at some of the future expectations, specifically of FDA and GFSI. And then we'll look at a little bit of what are the actions that you can take in order to prepare. And so on the next slide, we understand that we're out here in the industry trying to run a business. We're trying to make our products, fill our POs, keep our customers satisfied, but there are just tons of rules and regulations that you've got to consider along the way, and additional regulations are coming. We see that right now there are heightened levels of recalls and health alerts, and really these types of training sessions, these types of webinars are intended to help keep your organization out of the news. Make sure that if you're in the news, it's for something positive, and that we are protecting your brands and we are protecting your consumers and protecting your business. So we look at the next slide, we're going to look a little bit at USDA. USDA right now, they're conducting verification procedures. They do this all the time in plants all across the country. But if you were to look back at the last 6 fiscal quarters and you were to look at the data, you will see that the number of verification procedures is increasing every single quarter. And it's not a nominal thing. It is a pretty strong rate of increase. When you put a trend line to it, you can see that there are 14,000 additional verification procedures per fiscal quarter for 6 quarters in a row. And despite all that extra checking and all of those extra things that are being verified, audit compliance rate has been flat. It has been right around 98%. So anywhere between 98 and 98.4. So it's really good that even though USDA is checking a lot, people are found to be compliant. When you compare that, on the other hand, to FDA, they're increasing their inspections right now. When you look at the audits and the inspections, they're up 6% year over year from 22 to 23, and we're on pace to see an additional 9% increase from 2023 to end of 2024. However, unlike USDA, FDA is finding more problems. Okay, recalls were up about 5% from 22 to 23, and the pacing right now shows that we're going to be up about 7% in FDA recalls by the end of 2024. So there's a lot of energy right there. with regulatory compliance, people are checking a lot of things, and sometimes they're finding things. And like I said, we need to stay ahead of the curve and make sure that we are following the rules and staying out of those recall situations and out of those brand damaging situations. We're going to look at some of the changes and just the quantity of changes in USDA now. From the beginning of the year, this is year to date, we have seen 41 published directives in USDA, and we have seen 13 published guidelines and 54 published notices. The directives are basically instructing FSIS, what do you do when you face this situation? How do you deal with this issue that you're going to run across in the field? The guidance and the guidelines are more directed towards the operators. So when you approach X for USDA, do it just like this, because this is the way that we're going to be found compliant. And the notices are more general consumption, more for the public at large. Okay, that you're not necessarily a food safety inspection official, you're not necessarily an operator, but USDA wants you to know. But still, there are 108 updates and changes just since the beginning of 2023. It's a lot to keep track of. And so some of the more notable ones are on the next slide here. Specifically, you see a directive instructing Food Safety Inspection Service how to protect people and how to detect instances where a product has been intentionally adulterated. So a threat agent has been added to a product by someone with malicious intent, somebody who is trying to harm the public through the food supply. Unfortunately, this does happen. It's something FDA has had an eye on for a while, and now we are seeing directives at Food Safety Inspection Service to say, look, this is what you do when you deal with that out in the field. So USDA has given these directives to their crew. Also, recently a 43-page document was issued. This was in March, and it is talking about your establishment's responsibility and what you have to do and what are the means for you to gain a USDA label. So label approval has tightened up and has changed a little bit, and we want to make sure that everybody is aware of what it takes to have a USDA approval stamped on your product. There's a new term that's come out that is in point 3. This is about violative residues. And so violative residues, so these are going to be residues that could be contaminants or adulterants or some kind problematic for the foodstuffs that we are generating. And this requirement states that you are going to have to verify the effectiveness of your program. And be aware that this FSIS guidance is specifically targeted at those who are doing livestock and poultry slaughter. So if you are in a slaughter facility and you have USDA on site every day, make sure that you have a way to verify the effectiveness of your program to stop residues from carrying through to that final product. Another point that is heavily emphasized by USDA is that there's a requirement now that in-house pathogen testing. So if you're doing pathogen testing of products or environmental monitoring, that work has to be validated. You have to be able to have a third-party accredited independent lab review what you're doing and validate the results such that, hey, we've done this in-house for a while now, and we've gotten good, favorable results. We're not having issues, and that has to be double-checked by a third party. So these are differences that are among those 108 that have been shared from USDA. And let's not forget about our friends at the EPA. So on the next slide, we're going to look a little bit at the effluent limitations. So when you think about effluent and discharge water from facilities, EPA has a lot to say about that right now. They are required to do a routine review of the per the Clean Water Act. And so during the routine required review, EPA started to establish what we need to be watching for slaughter and processing facilities. Okay, these also for rendering operations and for further process plants. And yes, it also applies to pet food. And a lot of pet food is going to be manufactured in facilities that are FDA governed, not USDA governed. And so the EPA requirements span, obviously, both types of facilities. If you're USDA or state or FDA governed, you're still under the jurisdiction of EPA. So when we look at what are they actually going to be checking in this effluent, we'll look at the next slide here. There are going to be some limitations that are proposed in January, and these are expected to become final in April 2025. So you'll be having folks check things like your BOD, your biological oxygen demand, certainly how much suspended solids are contained in that waste stream, particularly looking at oil and grease levels, and then a heavy emphasis on nitrogen and on phosphorus. And this is going to affect at least 850 meat and poultry producing facilities. That number could go up, but that is the current estimate from EPA. And when you think about what does it mean in the floor, or what does it mean in the facility, on the work floor, you're probably going to see more enzyme-based sanitation. Okay, so you're going to see sanitizers that are not necessarily quaternary ammonia that has a bunch of nitrogen in it. So that's one example of an impact. But you can check out that that direction from the EPA and get the full details. That will be included at the end of this presentation. We also have to be attentive to what's happening with OSHA and what they have in store specific to heat stress. And so on the next slide, we're going to see, there we go, heat injury and illness prevention. So this is currently a proposed rule, okay, and it has been in discussion for a long time, since November 2023, and it's going to require that employers provide a plan, have a plan to prevent heat injury and illnesses, and you will designate one or more heat safety coordinators in your facility, and you'll have to monitor the workplace for any of the environments that are classified as heat triggers. And so when you think about this, and we'll look at the next slide here, we'll look at what a heat trigger means. So basically, if you have a heat index of 80 Fahrenheit or higher, then you have reached an initial heat trigger. That is also in effect if you have a wet bulb globe temperature that is equal to the NIOSH recommended alert limit. You'd have a high heat trigger rather than initial heat trigger if you got to the heat index of 90 Fahrenheit or a wet bulb globe temperature equal to the NIOSH recommended exposure limit. So you have an alert limit and an exposure limit. And if you get to your initial heat trigger, there's a whole list of requirements that you're going to have to do at the plant level in order to stay compliant. If that temperature goes over 90, now you have to do all of the 80-degree requirements plus additional steps because you've reached your high heat trigger. And so at a plant level, let's look at that and let's think about, next slide, what does it mean? You know, if you are running an industrial fryer or ovens, or maybe you have a drying operation or large boilers or steam kettles, you may be facing requirement for rest breaks to prevent heat-related illness. And that break has to remove the person from that hot area. They have to be in an area that is air conditioned or at least has increased air movement. Also, you will be required to provide cool, potable drinking water, sufficient to provide a quart per employee per hour that they are subjected to that environment. So when you think about things like post-harvest work, so somebody's working outdoors and they're bringing product into a facility for an initial process. When you think about all of these different situations where you could easily run into temperatures that are over 80 Fahrenheit, you got to be aware that there is a push right now for this to become the final rule of law. I was talking just the other day to a friend of mine who works with this, and the intent is for the proposed rule to move forward with little to no changes. That doesn't mean that you don't have a chance to speak up. There is a public comment right now. You can reach out and comment on this. And there's a link if you wanted to send comments to OSHA. That is included as well at the end of the presentation. Now, we're going to look a little bit at FDA. FDA has a lot of different things in the works as well. FDA is looking at sodium in a big way. They're set a 3-year target for both the mean and the upper bound sodium concentrations in a huge variety of food categories. There are a lot of different food products involved with this, and you'll want to look at the second edition that was published in August of the guidance document for voluntary reduction goals. So we know how this works. There's a guidance document and it's all voluntary, and they really want you to push towards this. And then pretty soon it's a proposed rule, and there's another public comment, and there might be some adjustments, but it's not going to be long before it is a final rule. And so we need to watch for this to play out throughout 2025 and be ready in our operations. Another interesting point is FDA's food additive and GRAS regulations allow the agency to establish limitations on the use of a food substance. So something could be considered GRAS so long as it's used in the manner that is approved or acceptable per FDA. And if it goes outside of those limitations, now we have a different question. So let's look at the next slide. Could we be seeing a point at which sodium is not considered GRAS, but is considered an adulterant if you put in more than what folks think that you ought to? And when you think about this, you think about it as a consumer, right? What is the consumer goal here, right? FDA wants to reduce the excess population sodium intake. So that is a consumer-based goal. That is not a goal that is looking out for producers and saying, what are the implications at the plant level? If we reduce the amount of sodium that is allowed, and someone has been making this product in the same formulation for decades, all of a sudden you got to change your labels, right? Maybe your ingredient order has changed because you've reduced the sodium, or maybe you don't have such a strong supplier for other flavor enhancers or for salt alternatives, right? And so there are a lot of different things that come into play, and you can, on this one as well, submit your comments by 11/14/2024 on the guidance. Okay, so it is a guidance document. It is voluntary, but it is the beginning of things to come. And so we want to be aware of those conversations. And I would be remiss to talk about FDA without bringing up food traceability rule. Food traceability rule is big. It is going to affect tons of operations throughout the country. And it is going to require that you record 8 different data points for each item that arrives in your facility on the food traceability list. And then you're going to have to gain some of that information from your suppliers. You're going to have to assign some of that information in your facility. You're going to have to pass that information on to your customers. And when you are asked for it, you have 24 hours to provide it to FDA. Now, when you think about the items on the food traceability list, things like your nut butters and your cheeses and your produce, and there's a large list that's published there. It is a lot to consider. And, I'm working on a separate session with Workforge where we're going to be looking at additional content and take a deep dive into FDR, the food traceability rule. And so when we look at that in a separate section, we're going to get a lot more material than what we were doing in this kind of an overview webinar of all these different regulations. Talking about FDA, on the next slide, you're going to see there are 20 rules that are currently under development. So FDA does publish and make public the rules that are being considered, the rules that are not proposed rule, not final rule, not guidance documents. These are what they're thinking about and what is coming down the pipeline. So right now, if you were to look at that list, some of the notable ones are going to be a definition of the term healthy. So what does it mean for a food item to be healthy? And so there are going to be criteria around that. And if you are healthy, there's going to be an emblem. The emblem will be leased by FDA relatively soon, and you can put that on the first on the front of your package and say, look, FDA says this is healthy. And again, this is about the consumer. It's consumer convenience. They walk through the storefront, they can see, oh, this is a healthy item set next to something that may not be considered healthy by FDA. Another big change is going to be the front of package nutrition labeling. So of course we all have to label our products, and we have to have our nutrition facts. The nutrition facts I do not expect to go away, but I think what we're going to see is a redundancy or a duplication of at least part of the nutrition facts that will be required on the principal display panel on the very front of your packaging. Okay, so on the front of the packaging, you're going to have certain nutrition information that is required, and then you will, in addition, have your standard nutrition facts area. Nutrient content claims are getting a lot of attention and will have some scrutiny. And this is going to be, hey, if you say that you're an excellent source of vitamin A or magnesium or any number of things, if you make a nutrient content claim, expect some regulations and some additional scrutiny of that in 2025. Also, you'll see with the salt reduction, as salt reduction takes place, you're going to see more and more use of salt substitutes, and there's going to be some information governing how salt substitutes are allowed to be used. So these are things that are very real, that are coming down the pike from FDA. Another thing is going to be certifications of imported foods. Imported foods will have a certificate of analysis with them that say, hey, we have safe levels of mercury, or we have safe levels of lead, or whatever it may be. We're microbiologically safe. They're going to have a certificate of analysis. But FDA is pushing very hard to require additional testing by those that are distributing those imported products to make sure that those are in fact valid claims. So FDA is not looking to do that testing. They're looking to the consumer to do the testing. I'm sorry, not the consumer, the distributor to do the testing. And so when the distributor sends it to the consumer, the FDA will do spot checks, post-consumer checks. So they will say, hey, this is already out in the market. It's already been through import. It's already been through distribution. It's already been to the shelf. A consumer could pick this up. And so FDA could pick that up, test it, and then instead of coming back to the importer, they can come back to the distributor. So that is going to be a difference. And there's some pushback on that in terms of jurisdiction. So if we look at the next slide about what happened at the National Food Policy Conference, this is where Jim Jones, our Deputy Commissioner of Human Foods, was speaking, and he shared a lot of insight in terms of the direction that he intends to take FDA. One of the things, again, is a full review of the GRAS list. What is on the GRAS list, and how does something get to be approved to be on the GRAS list? Yes, historically things have been added and dropped from the GRAS list now and again, but I think we're going to see a wholesale review of all of it. And there may be items that have been used for a very long time that are pushed out and no longer GRAS, or there could be caps put on that this is going to be considered safe as long as it's used within this framework. Again, post-market chemical testing programs, so pushing FDA to check for chemical residues, or to check for allergens, or to check for other chemical threats that could be present in the food product. So additional post-market checks, those are very much on the radar, and were shared by Jim Jones in his speech, targeting the future reductions in sugar content. So we're not just talking about salt here. Certainly added sugar is on the radar. And once the sodium reduction is in place, or maybe even happening at the same time, as the sodium reduction is getting established, you're going to see this push towards added sugar reductions. Again, what does that mean for formulation? What does that mean for supply chain? What does that mean for all the different elements that it takes to run your operation? You're going to have new inventory items potentially. You're going to have different labeling, different packaging, all kinds of different things come into play. There is going to be an increase in operating expenses if that lands. FDA, as I had mentioned, they really want to look at imports in a more aggressive manner, and they don't have the authority to require the importers to conduct the product testing, but they have already gone to Congress and requested congressional approval to do that. And so if they get the congressional approval, they will be able to force the importers, and by extension, they'll be able to look at the distributors in terms of validating all of the claims that are made on the foreign producers' COAs. Again, you'll also see restrictions coming on colors. So there have been some state bans and some state level restrictions on red 40 and on some of the yellows and blues and some of the different artificial colors. And you can expect to see FDA take a broader look at that and say, look, if we're going to restrict this in one state, what does it mean if we started to look at that nationally, to restrict it nationally? So that is very real content that is coming from Jim Jones himself in terms of how he intends to direct FDA moving forward. If we look at the whole picture, we have to also consider GFSI. In the next slide, we're going to look at, these are not folks that have jurisdiction or regulatory authority in the United States, but this is somebody that is the Global Food Safety Initiative that is looking at the entire global food safety system. And so they have a recent conference in Singapore where they had 4 primary focus topics. The first was innovation and using innovation as a keystone. And what does that mean? A keystone for food safety. It means using AI for tracking and tracing. It means using AI for product testing and for trending and things like that. So there's a big push on technology and innovation, and specifically there were a lot of mentions of AI. Also, there's a push to establish a global alliance of all of the actors in the food safety system. And so a global unified understanding of what does it mean to be food safe? What does it mean to have something that is commercially sterile, or something that is pasteurized, or something that is safe for human consumption? What does that mean across borders? And that requires GFSI to be navigating standards worldwide. When you look at what are the standards of food safety in Singapore versus in Taiwan versus in Ireland versus in Canada versus, you fill in the blank. There are a lot of variants in what constitutes a food safe product, and GFSI is trying to standardize this and trying to roll it all into one set of shared understanding. But that may not hit home as much as the 4th pillar that they're looking at, which is treating sustainability as part of food safety. Now, certainly when we think about food safety, we're thinking about adulterants. We're thinking about chemical adulterants and physical adulterants and microbiological adulterants. We're thinking about elements that could cause harm to the consumer. The GFSI perspective is that if you are not running your plant in a sustainable manner, if you are not taking care of carbon and emissions and things like that, this also could ultimately cause harm to the consumer. And so GFSI is really trying to dovetail sustainability into food safety in a way that has never been done in this country. And what does that mean? GFSI is establishing our standards for third-party audits. We have SQF10 coming out, and SQF10, when that rolls out, I know people that are working on SQF10 right now, and they have assured me that there's going to be a heavy emphasis not only on technology and innovation, but there's going to be a heavy emphasis in SQF10 on sustainability practices. And it's not just SQF. I mean, BRC or anybody that falls under that GFSI purview is going to apply the goals that were laid out in the GFSI conference. And so we want to be very aware of that as we're moving forward, that it's going to get heightened attention, even though it's not a final rule of law. It may be a customer requirement that we have these third-party audits in place, and so that means that we have to march to a certain drum in order to stay in business. And so we're going to look at what does this mean? What does this all mean for food safety? We'll look at the next slide for a minute. Everything starts and ends with food safety. Anytime I'm doing presentations, I try and bring this fact out. It does not matter what your role is. It does not matter what tasks you're doing. What matters is that you have a food safety focus, that you're protecting that end user, because if you are harming that consumer, that is bad for business, and that is bad for your conscience and for everything else, right? So you're not here to hurt people. You're not here to endanger the public. If we were to look at the financial implications of food safety events or food safety issues, they're very, very high. But when we think about what do all these regulations mean for food safety, there are also other impacts on operations. When you introduce a new program because you have to do additional traceability, or you introduce a new ingredient because you have to offset in your flavor profile the absence of sodium, or you introduce anything that requires new packaging or training, it goes on, and you end up experiencing heightened operating expenses. Now, this is an industry that is very thin margin, and so you're not making a lot of margin per sale, and you have to watch your operating expenses so that don't damage the bottom line. And so you want to think about what are the potential offsets that you could do in your own facility to gain efficiencies, to make sure that the regulatory requirements of 24 and 25 don't really put you in a bind. So these are really important. And so the big question next is, what am I supposed to do about it? I'm trying to make my pork products. I'm trying to make my spaghetti noodles. I'm trying to make my brownies. I am trying to run a plant. What am I supposed to do with all these changing targets and all of these new regulations? We'll look at the next slide and we'll go into that just a little bit. On this slide, you want to think about, being proactive. Being proactive means monitoring changes. It means paying attention and really building a team, having a team of folks that are dialed in on this, that are watching what's happening in the regulatory circles and what's happening in compliance, and watching the entire regulatory horizon. And then being communicative, letting people know, hey, this is going to change what happens when operations handles this item, or hey, this is going to change what happens when we are communicating with our customers. Whatever the changes are, they've got to be communicated, and they've got to be really over communicated. The second point here is really looking at implementation, and implementation in advance. You don't wait until it's standing right there at your feet. You want to know what's coming, be proactive, understand the changes, and act before the compliance date. Think about food traceability rule, and when did that become final rule of law? And the compliance date is not until January 2026. The time to act is now. It is right now. Okay, and so you need to be over communicating to your top tier leadership, to your executives and your C-suite individuals, the implications of new regulations and what has to be adjusted at the plant to stay compliant. And then you want to look at streamlining. Can you automate tracking? Can you digitize records? And really a big point is, don't bear it all alone. It's so much to manage. You don't have to manage it all. You can bring in a partner, a trusted partner that's solid and is going to help you along. Someone like Workforge that is not just looking at this regulatory landscape, but is giving you practical actions and practical training assets that can be implemented. When you think about final thoughts on this, final thoughts on this presentation, seeing that regulatory landscape, stepping back from your process and saying, okay, I'm going to look at regulatory today. I'm going to look at everything that's out there. Well, frankly, that's not good enough. You're going to get burned. You're going to see something that comes up that you should have already been working on, and now you have an obstacle. You have an obstacle that is going to impede your ability to be compliant because you never even realized it was regulation. It's important to see 15 feet past the horizon. Seeing what's on the horizon is great, but it's not good enough in this industry. You have to look past the horizon. And that's where you really need to have a concentrated team of people working on this. You have to have a regulatory group. You have to have a compliance officer. You have to have a partner that's external to your operation. You have to have some kind of way of staying ahead of the horizon. This is a huge, ever-changing undertaking. Okay, it is very, very involved. and to roll the regulations into something that is comprehensible for your team, applicable in your facilities, and knowing what your action plans look like and when do they take effect and who's going to be accountable for them. Having all that stuff sorted out before those compliance dates is critical. And I guess the last big point is that you just don't have to do it alone. I'm going to keep putting out content with WorkForge. We're going to keep putting things together and bringing opportunities for these conversations forward. We're happy to be a partner with this type of work and really to help everybody stay food safe and stay compliant every step of the way. And so those are my remarks about what is coming in 2025. And I hope you stay tuned for the additional content that will be coming up specific to food traceability rule. And I think I'm going to throw it back to Alex.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that, Erik. Really enjoyed the content.